It was a chilly Thursday evening in late September, the kind of Oregon dusk that painted everything in muted grays and made the pine trees sway like old secrets. I had just left the office, my coat tucked under one arm, my phone buzzing with another message from my mom asking what I wanted for dinner. I remember ignoring it. My mind was elsewhere, somewhere heavy and unfocused. That's when I saw him. Not the man who would later steal my heart and nearly ruin my life, but the man beside him. An elderly homeless man sat slouched against the stone wall near the grocery store, a cardboard sign resting between his feet. Hungry. Anything helps. His hands trembled slightly, and he looked down at the ground like he didn't want to exist. What caught my attention wasn't the man himself, but the stranger kneeling beside him. Young, tall, dressed casually, but something about his posture, how he crouched down to eye level with the old man, how gently he placed the grocery bag in front of him, froze me in my tracks. I lingered a few feet away, pretending to check my phone. The stranger opened a bottle of water and handed it over like it was something sacred. Then he smiled. Not a smug smile. Not a look at me being charitable smile. Just warm. The old man reached for the bottle with shaky hands. "God bless you," he whispered, eyes welling up. "I hope it keeps you going for a few days," the stranger said softly, patting his shoulder. I couldn't stop watching. The moment felt almost staged, like something out of a movie. And yet it was so disarmingly real. There was a tenderness in that interaction I hadn't seen in years, maybe ever. I walked forward, pulled a few bills from my wallet, and dropped them into the old man's box. He looked up at me like I'd just given him the world. The stranger looked up, too, and our eyes met. "That was kind of you," I said, trying not to sound awkward. He stood up, brushed his jeans, and smiled. "You too. Most people just walk right past." "Most people don't know what to do," I replied. "Yeah," he nodded and extended his hand. Tyler Grant." I hesitated for half a second before taking it. Megan Foster. I was just about to grab a coffee. "There's a place nearby with the best espresso in town. Would you want to join?" It wasn't the kind of invitation I usually accepted, but something about his energy was magnetic, gentle but assured, calm in a way I didn't know I needed until that moment. "Sure," I said, surprising even myself. The cafe he led me to was tucked between two brick buildings, dimly lit with string lights curling across the ceiling. As we sat down, I noticed the way he talked, thoughtful, unhurried, like he wasn't trying to sell himself to me, which already made him more interesting than any man I'd met in the past 5 years. He loved seafood. So did I. He was a wine enthusiast. I had a secret obsession with Oregon Pinot Noir. He volunteered at children's shelters. I'd been supporting the local youth foundation since college. "It's rare to meet someone who still notices people," I said, stirring the foam of my cappuccino. He leaned back, fingers laced over his knee. "It's rarer to meet someone who actually does something about it." I smiled almost shyly. I wasn't used to being seen like that, like someone good. That night, something shifted. I walked out of that cafe with the kind of lightness I hadn't felt in years. There was a rhythm in my chest I couldn't explain. And as I watched Tyler disappear down the street after walking me to my car, I didn't know yet what was coming, but I remember thinking, maybe this time love will be different. Maybe this time I won't be the one getting hurt. You might think that growing up in a wealthy family meant I had it easy, and in many ways I did. I never worried about bills or groceries. I never questioned whether I'd go to college or whether there would be a future waiting for me when I got out. But money doesn't shield you from loneliness, and it definitely doesn't teach you how to trust the right people. My parents, George and Helen Foster, were what most would call old money, except they didn't act like it. My father built his business from the ground up, starting with a small lumber operation he inherited from his grandfather. Over the decades, he turned it into a successful chain of woodworking shops and supply stores across Oregon. But we didn't have private chefs or yachts. My dad still drove a truck with paint stains on the seats. My mom still clipped coupons, even if just out of habit. There's pride in simplicity, Dad always said, and no pride at all in throwing money around. They raised me to be grounded. I grew up with dirt under my nails, helping Mom plant tulips in the garden and sanding wood scraps in Dad's workshop. I learned early on that wealth was a responsibility, not a license. But the one thing they couldn't prepare me for was how to protect my heart. I left Bend at 18 to study business and nonprofit leadership at the University of Washington. I stayed in Seattle for a few years after graduation, working with a few youth outreach programs, hoping I could make something of my own, not just inherit my parents' empire. And I tried to date. I really did. But somewhere between the fancy dinners and the not-so-subtle questions about my last name, I began to realize something. Most men didn't see me for me. They saw a number, a connection, an access point. The first time it happened, I brushed it off. The second time, I started building walls. By the fifth, I'd built a fortress. Even when I moved back to Bend and joined the family business, handling public relations and our community partnerships, I kept my distance. I focused on work, on volunteering, on animals, kids, and anyone who needed help. It was easier to give love than to ask for it in return. At night, I'd come home to the house my parents built on a quiet slope overlooking the lake. My bedroom still had the bookshelves Dad made me when I was 12. The lilac curtains Mom picked out in high school. It was peaceful, but also hollow. Sometimes I'd stay up late just scrolling through photos of weddings and babies on social media, wondering when, if ever, it would be my turn. But I wasn't bitter. At least, that's what I told myself. I'd convinced myself that I was just selective, cautious, waiting for someone who truly saw me. Someone who didn't care that my parents had 3 vacation homes, or that my last name was printed on the sign above half the lumberyards in the state. Someone who would love me if I had nothing at all. I dreamed of that man since I was 16. I just never thought I'd meet him standing outside a grocery store, handing a bottle of water to a stranger with shaking hands. But there he was, Tyler Grant, kind eyes, steady hands, a voice that didn't rush. A man who didn't look past people. A man who saw the value in compassion, not currency. That first night at the cafe, he didn't ask me where I worked. He didn't mention money. He just talked about books he liked, the last hike he went on, and the shelter he'd recently donated blankets to. I remember thinking, he has no idea who I am. And that's perfect. Because maybe, just maybe, if he saw me without the name, without the money, without the expectations, he might fall in love with the girl who still believed in good people. And God help me, I was already halfway there. Our second date felt like something out of a dream. Tyler texted me that morning with a simple message. Don't ask any questions. Just give me a few hours. I promise you won't regret it. I'd barely slept the night before, replaying every word from our first evening together, like it was a favorite movie I did not end. And now here he was again, mysterious, confident, and completely impossible to resist. When he pulled up in front of my parents' house that afternoon, he stepped out of the car holding a bouquet of wildflowers, not roses. Too cliché, he said with a grin, as if he already knew me well enough to skip the performative gestures. The drive took us away from downtown Bend, winding along the edges of the Deschutes River until we reached a place I'd never seen before, a hidden trail that led to a quiet, crystal blue lake nestled between pine-covered hills. I come here when I need to think, he said, taking my hand as we walked toward the water. This place reminds me of what real love should feel like. Still, safe, unshakable. At the shoreline, 2 swans drifted across the lake, one white, one a soft gray. Look at them, he whispered. He follows her everywhere, like he was born to protect her. I watched as the gray swan moved in tandem with the white, their feathers brushing gently. It was almost too poetic to believe, and yet completely real in that moment. Tyler turned to me. His gaze wasn't intense, it was calm, reverent. Like he wasn't just seeing me, he was choosing me. And then, just like that, he kissed me. It wasn't rushed or demanding. It was quiet, certain, the kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything but promised everything. I didn't want to leave. When he offered to take me to a nearby cabin cafe for dinner, I almost said no, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't want to break the spell. Just a little longer, I whispered, clutching his coat around my shoulders. Let's stay right here. We sat on an old bench overlooking the water, talking about nothing and everything. Childhood memories, books we both loved, the stray dogs he used to sneak into his garage when he was a kid. I told him about the injured bird I once nursed back to health when I was 10. He laughed. You've always had a thing for lost souls, haven't you? Maybe I had. Maybe that's why I didn't see it coming. At the end of the night, he kissed my hand and said, Megan, I don't want to rush anything, but I haven't stopped thinking about you since the moment we met. And neither had I. The next morning, I woke up smiling. I don't remember the last time I did that. I practically floated through the day, humming while I answered emails, grinning while I stocked new inventory at the main lumber showroom. A week later, Tyler told me more about his volunteer work with shelters and orphanages. I try to visit the kids once a week, he said. Toys, clothes, anything they need. I didn't hesitate. Can I help? He paused. Sure, though honestly what they need most is funding. People donate goods all the time, but the directors never have enough for utilities, repairs, medical needs. If you want to help, I can show you where to send money. I just send it straight to their director. That way it doesn't get lost in overhead. He made it sound so reasonable, so selfless. The next morning, I wired over the first transfer, then another, then another. Every time he said he was visiting the kids, I'd send more. For the new beds, for the gym repairs, for the winter coats. He never asked for a dime. That's what made me trust him more. And then came the dinner with my parents. Tyler showed up in a tailored navy suit, not flashy, just dignified. He brought my mother a bouquet of gardenias and a rare bottle of bourbon for my dad. He even complimented the painting in the hallway that no one had ever noticed before. He listened when my dad told his usual stories. He asked about my mom's roses. He laughed at the right moments. He fit in too easily, and I was too happy to question it. At the end of dinner, he took my hand and said, George, Helen, I know it's early, but I can't imagine another day without Megan. I'd like your blessing to ask for her hand in marriage. I froze. My mom gasped. And my dad, my stubborn, cautious, overprotective dad, smiled. If she says yes, he said, then you already have ours. And I did say yes. Of course I did, because in that moment, I believed I had finally found the man who wouldn't use me, the one who saw me, not my family's name or their bank account. I thought I found my person. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of those rare, perfect days in Bend. Crisp, sunny, not a cloud in sight. I had just finished helping my mom trim the gardenias by the back porch when I realized I was out of almond milk. A trivial thing, really, but I remember it vividly because that trip to the grocery store changed everything. I didn't even plan to go to that store. It was one of the smaller markets, tucked on the edge of town, near the industrial district. I hardly ever went there, but it was on the way back from the nursery, and I figured, why not? I parked, walked toward the entrance, and then stopped cold. Across the street, just outside the liquor store, stood Tyler. My Tyler, except he wasn't alone. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't helping. He was yelling. At first, I couldn't hear what he was saying. His back was to me, shoulders tense, one hand clenched around the leather folder he always carried. Standing a few feet away was an older, homeless man, maybe the same man we'd seen that very first day. And Tyler was screaming at him, not just frustrated, furious, red-faced, unhinged. He shoved the man hard. The old man stumbled backward, landing on the curb with a thud. His belongings, a torn backpack, a plastic bag of clothes, spilled into the street. Tyler didn't stop. He took that leather folder and struck the man. Once, twice, and then As if that wasn't enough, he kicked the old man's duffel toward the oncoming traffic, its contents scattering beneath the wheels of a passing delivery van. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I stood frozen near the entrance of the store, one hand still gripping the handle of my purse, the other clutching the edge of the shopping cart like it was the only thing keeping me upright. That wasn't the man I knew. That wasn't the man who kissed my forehead and talked about children's shelters and swan love stories. That was someone else. Or maybe that was who he'd been all along. He stormed off without another word, disappearing into his car. The old man sat slumped on the pavement, too stunned to react. A clerk came running out, phone in hand, and I watched the scene fade behind the closing glass doors as if it were happening to someone else. I didn't shop that day. I went home in silence. My mom was making soup in the kitchen, humming to herself. I told her I had a headache and went straight to my room. I didn't cry. Not yet. I was too numb for that. Instead, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the old man had attacked him first. Maybe there was some explanation. But no version of Tyler Grant that I knew would raise his hand to a defenseless man, especially not after everything he'd told me. Everything he'd made me believe. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I remembered something he'd said, offhandedly like it was no big deal, about the children's shelter, the address, the one he supposedly visited every Wednesday. I would go there myself, not to accuse, not to confront, just to know the truth. Because if I was wrong about that, if I was wrong about him, then I needed to know now, before the wedding, before I handed him any more pieces of myself. I told my parents I had errands in the next town over. My dad offered to send one of the drivers, but I insisted on going alone. I needed space. They didn't question it. The shelter was smaller than I expected. A pale blue building with chipped paint and a sagging fence. But it had a warmth to it. Children's drawings taped to the windows, flower pots lining the steps. The woman at the front desk looked up when I walked in. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I'm helping someone who said he works with your shelter. Tyler Grant. He's been donating supplies and phones, and I just wanted to follow up, make sure everything arrived okay." Her face twisted in confusion. "I'm sorry, who?" "Tyler. He said he comes here weekly. Tall, dark hair, usually brings gifts for the kids, phones, coats, sports equipment." She shook her head slowly. "I've worked here for 4 years. We haven't had a visitor like that, and certainly no large donations. We'd remember something like that." I felt my stomach drop. I pressed again, softer this time. "Maybe under another name?" "No," she said gently, "but we could really use someone like that." I stood there, blinking, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Every dollar I'd wired, every sweet word he'd said, all of it a lie? I thanked her, took down their donation information, and walked out slowly, like I'd just stepped off a moving train and couldn't quite find the ground beneath my feet. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Tyler, again. By the time I got back into my car, my phone had buzzed 7 times. All from Tyler. Missed calls, 2 voicemails, and a text that simply said, "Where you, babe? You okay?" I stared at the screen, still parked outside the shelter that supposedly didn't know him. Then I drove. Not home. Not yet. I needed to think. I ended up at a small overlook near the lake, the same one he'd brought me to just a few weeks before, where the swans had floated peacefully and he'd whispered that real love was quiet and eternal. I remember standing there, gripping the cold metal railing, trying to keep my hands from shaking. It had all been a performance. The swans, the children, the flowers, every detail of our story crafted by a liar. And the worst part, I didn't even see it. I let him in. I let him near my family. I let him near my heart. The rage came slow, like a kettle taking its time to boil, but when it rose, it scalded. Not just anger at him, but at myself. For believing, for trusting, for giving him so many chances to lie to my face and call it love. But grief and fury weren't enough. I needed proof. I needed him to show his true face, not just to me, but to everyone. And for that, I needed help. That night, I called Samantha. She picked up on the second ring. "Megan, is everything okay?" "I need a favor," I said, my voice flat hollow. "And I need you to keep this between us." Samantha was my oldest friend, someone I'd met in theater camp before either of us knew what pain really looked like. She'd gone on to act full-time in Portland, indie films, stage work, the occasional commercial. But she still had that sharp, fearless spirit I remembered from our teenage years. The kind of girl who could become anyone. And that's exactly what I needed. "You want me to act?" she asked when I laid it all out. "No," I said. "I want you to help me act. I need to become someone else. Just for a day." We met the next morning at her apartment. I brought coffee and 2 full pages of notes. She brought a suitcase full of makeup, wigs, and thrifted clothes. Raymond, my family's longtime security guard, was already waiting outside. When I asked him for help, he didn't ask questions, just nodded once and said, "Tell me what you need." Together, the 3 of us created her. The woman Tyler would never recognize. I became older, hunched, weathered. Samantha taught me how to apply shadow in all the right hollows of my face, how to smudge the lines around my mouth and age the skin under my eyes. We knotted my hair under a gray wig, added a scarf, layers of ragged clothing, a plastic bag full of crushed soda cans and worn-out socks. I even stuffed a few almonds in my cheeks to change my speech. Samantha's idea, of course. Raymond watched from across the room, arms crossed, jaw tight. When I finally stood up in full disguise, he blinked. "Damn," he muttered. "That's convincing." We drove in silence, not toward the house, not toward Tyler's apartment, toward the upscale cafe he liked to frequent, the one where he'd once ordered us imported oysters and laughed about how Ben never changes. I waited a block away. Tyler's car showed up exactly at noon, on schedule, arrogant as ever. I limped toward him the moment he stepped out of the driver's seat. "Mr." I croaked, voice trembling, my hand stretched forward. "Mister, could you spare some food? Please, I haven't eaten in days." He didn't even look at me. "Back off, you disgusting freak," he snapped. I flinched, startled by the venom in his voice. "You don't belong here. Go bother someone else before I call the cops." And then, under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear, he added, "Filthy waste of space." He pushed past me and went inside. I stood frozen for a moment, then slowly peeled off the scarf. Samantha was already pulling up in her car. Raymond was watching from the cafe's side entrance. I didn't need more confirmation. I had seen everything I needed. Tyler Grant wasn't a misunderstood man with a broken heart. He was a predator, and I was done playing his game. Raymond didn't say much on the drive home. He just kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the inside pocket of his jacket, where I knew from childhood he always kept the badge from his days in law enforcement. It wasn't for show. He carried it like a memory, like a line he swore never to cross. That night, I didn't eat. I didn't even go upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet, the same chair where Tyler had once charmed my parents, pouring whiskey for my dad and complimenting the ceramic rooster on the shelf behind the stove. Now, the silence he left behind was louder than any toast he ever gave. I didn't sleep that night either, but this time it wasn't grief. It was focus. By morning, I had everything prepared. Bank transfers, message threads, dates, wire instructions, the shelter's address, the director's testimony, a full account of every lie. And then, I told my parents. I thought they'd be angry. I thought they'd scold me for falling for someone like him, for ignoring the red flags, for letting love blind me. But instead, they both just froze. My father, who rarely raised his voice, leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, and said quietly, "How much did he take?" "Not everything," I whispered, "but more than enough." My mother reached across the table and gripped my hand, her eyes already glistening. "You're okay, though?" she asked. "He never hurt you?" "Not the way you mean," I said. "But yeah, he hurt me." The silence that followed was the kind that didn't need words. Because in that moment, they weren't worried about money. They were worried about me, their only daughter, the girl they'd raised to believe in good, to give the benefit of the doubt. And now they saw exactly what that cost me. "I'll handle it," my father said finally. And I believed him. George Foster didn't get to where he was by being passive. He was quiet, yes, measured, patient, but once he committed to something, it got done. Within days, he had lawyers reviewing every transfer, every statement. He made some calls, and then some more. Tyler didn't see it coming. He probably thought I'd disappear, that I'd slink away in shame and let it all go, maybe blame myself for being gullible, that I'd pretend it never happened. He had no idea who I really was. By the time the authorities found him, he was already trying to move. His apartment half-packed, his accounts suspiciously low on funds. It turned out I wasn't the first woman he'd targeted. He had a pattern: short engagements, romantic backstories, vague connections to nonprofits. Just enough charm to pass through dinner with a rich family without raising suspicion. But he'd never aimed this high before. He didn't know that this time, the girl he played had an entire legal team behind her. A father with political connections. A mother who tracked every cent of the household budget since 1986. And a security guard who had seen enough in his lifetime to know when a man's eyes told one story while his hands told another. The trial came quickly. Fraud, identity deception, grand theft, attempted wire fraud. His record sealed the rest. Some of the money was returned, most of it, thankfully. But that wasn't the part that mattered. What mattered was that he was exposed, that he wouldn't be able to charm his way into another family's home, another girl's trust, another mother's blessing. When the sentence was read, I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I just sat there steady, not victorious, not vindictive, just free. But freedom is a strange thing after betrayal. It doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like silence, like the absence of waiting, of hoping, of pretending, the kind of quiet that makes you face yourself again. And I did, slowly, one morning at a time. It took me a few weeks to feel human again. I stayed busy, volunteering more, reading more, organizing storage closets that didn't need organizing. Anything to keep from thinking too much, from remembering how fast things had unraveled. But there was one thing I couldn't stop thinking about. The shelter, the real one, the one Tyler had never stepped foot in. The director, a woman named Joanna, had been kind during our first meeting, even though she had no idea what kind of truth I was chasing that day. Before I left, she handed me a small flyer with a handwritten note across the top. "If you ever want to help, we'd love to have you." 2 weeks later, I walked through the shelter gates again. This time not as a suspicious fiancé, not as someone on the brink of heartbreak, but just as myself. It was late morning. The playground echoed with kids' voices. There was chalk on the sidewalks, a basketball half deflated near the steps, and music playing softly from the kitchen window. It felt real, alive. Joanna met me at the front and smiled. "You came back." "I meant to sooner," I said. "I needed time." She nodded like she understood more than I said aloud. We walked the grounds together, classrooms, dorm-style rooms, a half-finished gym that badly needed updating. "If you're serious about helping," she said, "we could use some muscle and a whole lot of love." I wasn't sure about the muscle, but the love. I had more of that than I knew what to do with. That's when I met him. He was standing on a bench outside the dining hall, arms stretched out like he was about to fly. Maybe 4 years old at most. Dark blonde curls, scraped knees, and a grin that made your heart ache a little. "Hi," he said proudly, like he'd been waiting for me. "I'm Jacob. Are you here to pick a kid?" I blinked. "Pick a kid?" Yeah, like take one home. I don't cry a lot. And I can make toast. I laughed, not out of humor, but something closer to heartbreak. No, sweetheart, I'm just here to visit. He looked disappointed, but only for a second. Then he hopped down and grabbed my hand. Okay, you can visit me. From that moment on, Jacob followed me everywhere. Every time I came back, twice a week at first, then more, he was the first to spot me. He'd wait near the gate, jumping in place, waving both arms like I was his whole world arriving in a used SUV. And that's where Daniel came in. He was the shelter's volunteer coach, a former amateur boxer turned youth mentor. Quiet, rugged, the kind of man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. And when he did, people listened. He worked with the older boys, teaching them discipline, confidence, how to fall and get back up again. He wasn't flashy or charming. He didn't try to impress anyone. But I watched the way the kids lit up when he walked into a room, and the way Jacob tugged his sleeve every time he wanted to show him something new. The first time Daniel and I spoke, it was because Jacob insisted we both push him on the swings. "You're good with him," Daniel said, watching Jacob giggle like it was the best day of his life. "I have no idea what I'm doing," I confessed. He smiled just barely. "That's how you know you're doing it right." After that, things unfolded quietly. We started talking more about the kids, the gym renovations, funding, curriculum ideas. Then we talked about books, movies, morning routines, fears. He never asked where I lived or what I did, or how I could afford to keep showing up with new supplies and snacks. He didn't seem to care. Or maybe he did, but he chose to respect my silence. And I didn't want to ruin it by telling him who I really was. Not yet. I told Joanna about it one afternoon, as we were stacking mats in the corner of the gym. "I know it's silly," I said, "but I just want him to like me, not the money, not the name." She looked at me gently. "Then let him see you first, and let the rest come later." So I did. I came in jeans and hoodies, tied my hair back, left my family name at the door, and just showed up, again and again. And every time Daniel was there, with his steady eyes, rough hands, and quiet understanding. And Jacob, with his endless questions, his drawings, his plans for building a toast-making robot so no one would ever go hungry again. I didn't know it then, but those two were about to change everything. It happened on a Thursday. I remember because I'd spent the morning helping Daniel repaint the inside of the new training room. Jacob had gotten hold of a roller and was accidentally leaving stripes along the baseboards. We didn't stop him. His joy was worth every touch-up. We finished around lunchtime. I was brushing flecks of white paint off my jeans when Daniel cleared his throat behind me. "I was thinking," he said, rubbing the back of his neck like he wasn't quite sure where to start. "You and me, we've been dancing around something." I looked up. He wasn't nervous, just careful, thoughtful like always. "You show up here," he said, "not for attention, not for applause, just because you care. I've seen you hold kids when they cried, laugh when they needed joy, and carry boxes twice your size without blinking." I smiled, feeling my heartbeat crawl into my throat. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a tiny box. "I don't have much," he said, opening it slowly. "But I know this. I want you in my life. I want to wake up knowing you're next to me, paint in your hair, Jacob snoring in the next room." I blinked. He didn't say, "Will you marry me?" the way people usually do. He just looked at me and whispered, "Be my partner. In this. In everything." And all I could do was nod. "I don't need the ring," I said quietly. "I just need you." But he insisted, slipped it onto my finger. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't gold. It was a silver band engraved with a simple word inside: home. That night, I went home earlier than usual. My parents were sitting on the porch with glasses of tea, watching the sunset. I walked up slowly, hands folded behind my back. Mom noticed first. Her eyes fell on my left hand. She gasped, "You're engaged." I nodded. "And before you ask, I added quickly, he doesn't know. Not about the money. Not the family name. Nothing. Dad stood slowly. But he knows you? I nodded again. The real me. They didn't ask to meet him right away. They didn't launch into questions. Instead, my father stepped forward, wrapped me in a hug, and said, "Then we already trust him." 2 weeks later, I brought Daniel and Jacob home. It was awkward at first. Jacob clung to Daniel's leg, and Daniel looked like he was preparing for a job interview with the Secret Service. But then Mom sat next to Jacob and asked, "So, how do you feel about helping me cook dinner for this loud bunch?" He lit up like a lantern. "I make the best toast." Dad laughed, clapped Daniel on the shoulder, and said, "Son, if you're willing to love my daughter without needing a resume, then you're already family." We didn't plan a big wedding. Daniel didn't want that. And truthfully, neither did I. We signed papers quietly. No flowers, no stage, no curated guest lists. Just the three of us, me, Daniel, and Jacob, walking into a courthouse one cool morning and walking out as something we'd never had before, a family. A month later, I found out I was pregnant. I told Daniel by placing a tiny pair of socks on Jacob's pillow. When he found them, he screamed loud enough to wake the neighbors. "She's having a baby. I'm going to be a big brother." And then he paused, looked at Daniel, and whispered, "Does that mean I still get toast?" We laughed until we couldn't breathe. Some nights, when the house is finally quiet, I walk out to the porch, hand resting on the small swell of my belly, and just breathe. The girl who once believed love had to be earned is gone now. In her place is a woman who understands that love isn't loud or dramatic. It's not about grand gestures or perfect stories. It's about truth, consistency, showing up again and again. It's Daniel kissing my forehead without needing a reason. It's Jacob crawling into bed at 2 a.m. because he had a bad dream, and we don't push him away. It's the life we built from broken pieces, not despite the cracks, but because of them. And in this quiet, ordinary life, I've found everything I was searching for.